before we begin, take a breath, settle in, and ask yourself one question. Have you ever heard of a place called Elmsbrook? No, you're not alone. It doesn't show up on modern maps. No signs, no records in state archives, no ruins listed in historical registries. And yet for 32 years in the early 19th century, it was a thriving village tucked into the forested hills of northern New York State, just miles from Lake Ontario. It had a chapel, a sawmill, a schoolhouse. It even had its own physician and apothecary, which was rare for such a remote community. But then one day in 1824, it vanished. Not just in the way forgotten towns fade away. Elmsbrook erased itself in fire, in silence, and in madness. What little we know now comes from fragments a charred parish registry recovered from a blackened stone crypt. A bundle of anonymous letters discovered in a Boston attic in 1889. A tattered field journal passed between institutions like a cursed relic, each one refusing to keep it for long. And then there's the bodies. Tiny bones unearthed where no burial grounds were ever declared. Femurs that don't match any known adult skeletons. Skulls no bigger than a grapefruit. This is not a ghost story. This is a record. A reconstruction of what happened to a town that was built on something ancient, something that should never have been disturbed. It begins with a promise of healing, of long life, of spiritual purity. But what it delivered was hunger. Not all hunger is physical. Some kinds burrow deeper than flesh. And sometimes the cradle you place your child in isn't meant to keep them safe. Ready. Then let's go back. The year is 1792. And the first stone of Elmsbrook has just been laid. The settlers who founded Elmsbrook did not come as pilgrims, not in the way we're taught to imagine. They weren't escaping persecution, nor were they seeking the promise of liberty. They came with purpose, quiet, intentional, entirely self-contained. Records show a small group, 23 men, women, and children, disembarked from a Danish brigantine on the southern shore of Lake Ontario in late autumn of 1791. They traveled inland by cart and foot, through what was then unbroken forest until they found a clearing they said had been shown to them in vision. Most of them were ethnic Carpathians. Their names weren't English, and their language bore a mixture of Old Slavonic and something no linguist has ever been able to fully trace. Local records, sparse as they are, list their leader as Father Jakub Mirek, a man with no known ecclesiastical ties, though he wore a cassock and carried a carved ashwood crucifix stained black with age. What's striking even from the earliest descriptions is the way they built their new settlement. The houses were arranged not around a commons or well, but around a cradle-shaped depression in the land rimmed by smooth stones etched with spiral motifs. They called it the first place. No one dared ask what that meant. The town's chapel was erected first, not last. Before homes, before fields. Beneath its foundation they laid a stone basin. According to an unverified account from a fur trader who visited in 1794, the settlers called it the vessel. At first, it was assumed to be a font for baptisms, but those who lived nearest the chapel said it was used only at night. The townsfolk never accepted outsiders easily. Any new resident had to undergo what they referred to simply as the offering. No details survive, but in one of Father Myrick's rare surviving letters he wrote, "The bones remember. The marrow carries light. And through the child's purity, the old blood is made clean." What did it mean? Scholars today offer guesses. Some call it symbolic language. But others, those willing to look closer, believe it was literal. It would be easy to dismiss it all as superstition until you learn what happened to those settlers in the decades that followed. People who should have died of consumption recovered overnight. Crooked spines straightened. Teeth grew back. Women well past childbearing age became fertile again. Some began to call it a miracle town. But not everyone healed. And not everyone who entered Elmsbrook was ever seen again. In every old town, there's someone who knows more than they ever speak. In Elmsbrook, that person was Anna Creel. She wasn't born there. Records suggest she arrived with Father Mirick's group, though her name appears in no ship manifests. A small woman, always dressed in black with silver hair twisted into a crown braid. Children were told to avoid her cottage at the edge of the woods, not because she was cruel, but because she was quiet, and because she always smelled faintly of smoke and bone broth even in summer. Anna was the town's only midwife. She attended every birth in Elmsbrook from 1793 to 1819, at least every one that was acknowledged. Her hands ushered in over 60 lives, but the survival rate was oddly low. Nearly a third of the children she delivered were listed as not viable. Stillborns, they called them. Silent births. The babies never cried, but no one ever saw the bodies. Anna said she buried them herself behind her cottage with prayer and care. And no one questioned her. Why would they? In Elmsbrook, death was part of healing. What few know, what only surfaced in the private journal of a traveling apothecary who visited in 1807, is that Anna kept a black-bound book in her kitchen wrapped in deerskin and sealed with iron clasps. The apothecary, a man named Lowell Nash, claimed to have glimpsed its contents when Anna left the room during a fever treatment. He wrote, "No scripture I've ever seen bears such language. The diagrams resemble infants, but their bones are splayed open, hollowed, pulverized, and beneath each drawing lines in a language that sickened me to read. I could feel it watching. It felt like hunger." That book, if it ever truly existed, was never recovered. What was found years later during a brief excavation of the ruins were 24 tiny jawbones buried beneath where her cottage once stood. All from infants, all carefully arranged around a stone bowl. In the bowl, fragments of calcified marrow fused with ash and beeswax. Archaeologists were baffled. Folklorists weren't. Because in certain regions of Eastern Europe among fringe Carpathian sects, there were whispered rites said to purify the aged through the essence of the newborn. Not through blood, through bone. They called it Coisca Communi, the cradle communion. A spoonful mixed with broth. Stirred 7 times, given only at night. Only after prayer. Only to those whose bones ached with age. The settlers of Elmsbrook believed they had found a way to defeat suffering. And Anna Creel was their priestess in all but name. But healing taken without cost never stays quiet. And in Elmsbrook, the bones had already begun to whisper. In the spring of 1803, Mayor Elias Alden collapsed on the steps of the Elmsbrook Chapel. He was 58, a former woodsman turned community leader known for his deep voice and even deeper limp. His right leg had been shattered years earlier in a mill accident. Since then, his bones had twisted with arthritis so severe he could barely rise from a chair without help. On that morning, he was found unconscious, fevered, raving. Anna Creel was summoned. What happened next would become the cornerstone of Elmsbrook's transformation from a secluded village with strange customs to what some began calling the Cradle of Healing. Alden was taken not to the clinic, but to Anna's cottage. For 5 days, no one was permitted to enter. Smoke rose from her chimney day and night, carrying a sour-sweet scent that many described as burnt milk and salt. On the 6th day, Elias Alden emerged from her door. Walking. Straight-backed, clear-eyed, laughing. He said his pain was gone, that something inside him had unlocked. When asked how, he simply replied, "The Lord provides when the vessel is right." He became a living miracle. His recovery was declared divine, and Anna Creel, though she never took credit, was no longer whispered about with fear. Instead, they brought her gifts, chickens, quilts. The names of children who'd fallen ill, the names of elderly relatives too weak to speak, and sometimes names of women who'd given birth to infants that didn't cry. Over the next 5 years, healing ceremonies became more common, quiet, night-bound, held not in the chapel but beneath it in a low stone room only certain families had access to. And while the town's children still ran and laughed and played, the number of newborns declined. No one talked about it. The birth records were intact, but many of the dates were left blank, and some entries had only a single word beside them, "with God." The town physician, Dr. Thorne Billings, once tried to question Anna. He asked what she put in the tinctures, why she boiled bones, and why she kept so many jars of powdered white ash in her cupboard. Her response was quiet. "What's given freely must be used carefully. Else it lingers. Else it stains." A year later, Dr. Billings left Elmsbrook in the middle of the night. His house was found empty, his medical notes burned, and no one mentioned him again. Because by then the townspeople believed. The ache in their joints had faded. Their coughs had disappeared. Even the blind began to speak of seeing light in their sleep. They were convinced they had found the path to purity. But purity, built on silence, is just rot beneath white cloth. And beneath Elmsbrook, the rot had already begun to speak. In the fall of 1810, a young seminarian named Edmund Harker arrived in Elmsbrook. He was 26. Sent by the diocese in Albany to fill a vacancy left by the sudden death of Father Mirek, whose passing had been described in the only surviving church notice as a peaceful departure sealed in prayer. Edmund had no reason to question it. He was earnest, naive, an idealist raised on the principles of devotion and duty. Elmsbrook, he thought, would be a simple place, a quiet stepping stone toward a larger parish. He lasted less than 2 years, but what he left behind, his private journals, scattered pages later, compiled by archivists under the title The Hollow Gospel, would become the most detailed first-hand record of Elmsbrook's hidden rites. From his first entry, unease seeps through. There is a stillness here, not the kind found in peace, but in the air before a storm. The people smile, they pray, they greet me with warmth. But I feel as though I've arrived in a place that is already mourning something it refuses to name. He soon noticed other things. The townspeople rarely attended confession. There were no baptisms, no weddings. But funerals, those were frequent and strange. He was never allowed to preside over them. Instead, the bodies, often children, were taken into the chapel at dusk and returned to their families the next morning in sealed pine boxes already buried deep in the woods by the town caretaker, a silent man named Ulrich. Edmund began to suspect something darker was at work, but he had no proof until one night in February 1811. Woken by a distant sound, scraping rhythmic deliberate, he lit a lantern and followed it to the chapel. There, beneath the altar, he discovered a narrow staircase leading to a root cellar he hadn't known existed. What he found, he never fully described, only fragments, hastily written stone floors. Symbols carved into the walls not Christian, not anything I recognize. A basin, stained, something thick clinging to the rim, and a cradle, a wooden cradle, empty. But the wood was warm. He returned to his room and vomited. The next morning, he confronted Deacon Halvers, a sharp-featured man who had served under Father Mirek and now led the town's daily rites. Halvers did not deny what Edmund had seen. Instead, he placed a hand on the young priest's shoulder and said, "You saw the path to wholeness, Father. Not everyone is strong enough to accept what healing truly costs." That night, Edmund began writing his journal in code, a cipher adapted from Latin liturgy interwoven with phonetic Czech. His entries became fragmented, paranoid, desperate, And yet, he stayed. Whether out of duty, curiosity, or fear, he continued leading Sunday services while secretly documenting what he could. Names, dates, patterns. He noted a chilling trend. The strongest of the elders, those with no sickness, no signs of age, are always seen leaving the cellar after funerals. They call it the renewal. I think they believe they are holy. And then came the entry dated March 12, 1812. Only 5 words. Jagged. Smudged with what looks like blood. I heard the baby's crying. She was called Lydia Crane, 22, recently widowed, soft-spoken, devout. The kind of woman people described as quietly good, the kind who left pies on doorsteps and sang hymns while fetching water. She lived alone on the eastern edge of Elmsbrook in a cottage that had once belonged to her parents. When she became pregnant, no one asked who the father was. In Elmsbrook, questions were considered a lack of faith. She gave birth in the early hours of October 9, 1812. Anna Creel was there, of course. A single lamp burned in the window all night, then vanished at dawn. What happened next would shatter what little resolve Edmund Harker still had. Lydia did not appear at Sunday Mass, nor Monday's market. Her cottage remained locked, her fireplace cold. 3 days later, Edmund forced open the door. Inside, he found a wooden cradle, empty. The linens were clean, folded, as if no child had ever touched them. And Lydia was gone. No body, no note, no sign of struggle. The town claimed she had gone to stay with cousins across the lake. But Edmund knew Lydia had no cousins, and no lake crossing had been recorded that week. So he returned to the chapel. This time he came with tools. He pried open the cellar door beneath the altar and descended with a lantern and a journal tied to his waist. The air was cold, wet, metallic. What he found in that stone-walled room beneath the house of God would never leave him. There were shelves upon shelves of clay jars, each labeled in looping script with dates and initials. Inside, something pale, granular. He dipped a finger into one and touched it to his tongue. Bone ash. In the center of the room stood a blackened iron cauldron, its interior slick with grease and residue. Nearby, a collection of wooden ladles worn smooth with use. But what turned his stomach most was not the tools or even the smell. It was the second cradle, identical to Lydia's. But this one was bolted to the floor, and beneath it, piled neatly in a silver basin, were tiny bones, skulls no larger than apples, ribs like dried flower petals, femurs like doll parts stacked like kindling. He found a book tucked beneath a stone shelf, bound in lambskin, unmarked, inside meticulous records, rituals, recipes, names. He recognized several, and then he turned the page and saw Lydia's name. Next to it, a note written in red ink: Mother willing, infant viable, marrow clean, returned to the flame with gratitude. Edmund dropped the book and fled. In the margins of his journal that night, he scrawled one frantic sentence again and again. They are not worshiping God. They are worshiping preservation. He didn't sleep. Instead, he began making plans to leave Elmsbrook, to expose it, to warn others. But something held him back. Fear, guilt, or something stranger. A sense that if he left without finishing the record, the truth would remain buried. He would stay. Just a little longer. Just long enough to finish the journal. He never intended to become part of it. On the night of February 3, 1824, a light was seen rising from the forest. Not a candle. Not a lantern. A column of flame. By dawn, the village of Elmsbrook no longer existed. Official records say it was a tragic accident, an overturned oil lamp in the chapel dry wood fast winds. Some speculated it was arson, Others blamed the harsh winter that year, claiming a stove or chimney must have sparked. But the few eyewitnesses, those who escaped, told another story. A story no one wanted to write down. Of the original 46 villagers, only 3 survived a mute child named Callum Gray, a woman half-blind with burns over her arms and throat, and an elderly man who died weeks later in an asylum, having clawed out both his eyes. What they said between tremors and prayers was this: the fire came from beneath. The cradle screamed. It wasn't fire, it was a mouth. Some rescuers found fragments among the ruins, melted glass, charred pews, the blackened bell of the chapel. But no bodies. Not one. Even the bones were gone. The earth where the chapel stood was scorched to a depth of 6 feet, as if something had boiled up from below. Beneath that, a hollow void lined with ash and stone. The foundation had collapsed into itself, a perfect basin. It was Edmund Harker's journal that surfaced next, discovered in a glass jar, buried near the riverbanks 2 months after the fire. Pages were missing. Others were warped by water, the ink smeared, but his final entry remained intact. It was dated the night of the blaze, and it read, "They took the last child. They placed him in the cradle." But something awoke. Something that remembers all the marrow taken, all the lives ground down to dust. It rose, and it fed. This is not justice. It is memory, and memory never burns away. The area was quarantined for nearly a decade, declared unstable, unfit for rebuilding. Maps were redrawn. The name Elmsbrook was struck from state records. Over time, the land was absorbed into private property, its history eroded by silence and trees. But certain things could not be buried, because even when the soil cools and the forests grow back, the earth remembers. And some nights when snow muffles the wind, those who pass near the clearing swear they hear it, the creak of a wooden cradle, rocking, back and forth, alone, waiting. Nearly 50 years passed. The forest grew thick again, roots veiling the past like scar tissue. Locals forgot, or pretended to. Hunters avoided the area without explanation. Children were told not to wander that deep into the pines. But in 1871, the land that had once been Elmsbrook was quietly purchased by a man named Dr. Wilhelm Kressner, a physician of Austro-Hungarian descent with a spotless medical record and no verifiable background prior to 1854. Using funding from a philanthropic medical board in Boston, he built a facility there. Not a hospital, but something more fashionable, the Cold Elm. Rise Therapeutic Institute. It promised rejuvenation, restorative health, gentle recovery from exhaustion, melancholia, gout, anemia, illnesses of the refined class. The institute welcomed only select patients, mostly wealthy and discreet, the sort who didn't ask questions about the land's history. Kressner was charming, educated. He claimed to have studied in Prague and Vienna, though no university confirmed it. And his methods, while unusual, were effective. He believed in the healing power of bone broth. But not just any broth. His kitchen used a proprietary marrow tonic, crafted, he claimed, from a secret Carpathian recipe. Patients drank it nightly, just a teaspoon dissolved in warm milk or wine. Within weeks, the testimonials poured in. My migraines vanished. I stood up without pain for the first time in years. My hands don't tremble anymore. I can write again. Some patients even claimed their hair darkened, their teeth regrew. One elderly woman announced she'd begun menstruating again at 72. The institute gained attention. Quiet, reverent attention. Not from newspapers, but from those in power. A senator's wife, a railroad heir, a bishop's daughter. They came, and they left, transformed. No one questioned where the tonic came from, or who prepared it. But beneath the institute, tucked behind reinforced stone walls that had once been a church cellar, lay the secret heart of Cold Elm Rise, an underground apothecary known only to staff as the Cradle Room. Access was restricted to 3 people: Dr. Kressner, his assistant, Dr. Enid Shale, and an old groundskeeper named Ulrich. Yes, the same Ulrich who had buried the children in Elmsbrook nearly half a century earlier. No one ever saw deliveries made to the cellar, but waste was hauled away weekly in heavy padlocked carts marked Medical Refuse. Burn only. No one dared ask what burned so dense it needed 2 men to lift it. But something else began to emerge, quieter than testimonials, harder to ignore. 11 children from the nearby orphanage went missing between 1872 and 1878. All under the age of 2. No bodies were found. No investigation succeeded. And at Cold Elm Rise the broth was always warm. Her name was Margaret Elsie, though she went by Maggie. 23, bright-eyed and newly graduated from the New York School of Nursing. She believed in science, in progress, in the healing power of compassion and fresh air. Cold Elm Rise, with its pristine corridors and well-dressed patrons, seemed like a dream first assignment. Her job was simple: assist in night rounds, change linens, and ensure the evening tonic was distributed to each patient. The staff were courteous, if distant. The doctors spoke softly. The patients smiled more than they should have. But there were rules. Strict, unspoken rules. She was never to enter the cellar hallway after dusk, never to ask about the broth, never to question the nurses in gray, older women with no surnames, no chatter, who moved in silence and vanished when the sun came up. Maggie was obedient. For a time. But curiosity has a way of unearthing what's meant to stay buried. It began with the smells. Each night around 3 a.m., a coppery sweet rot drifted up the vents. She asked the kitchen staff if something had spoiled. They only smiled and said, "It's the root broth. Takes time." Then came the sounds. Not voices, not exactly. More like murmurs, rhythmic, faint, as though someone were humming a lullaby from beneath the floor. One night, passing by the staff chapel, she paused. A gray nurse stood before the altar, her hands folded not in prayer but cradling something invisible. She rocked it gently and whispered, back and forth, bone to bone. No cry, no breath, only gift. Maggie didn't sleep that night. Then came the incident with patient 12B, Mrs. Lillian Forthwell, age 84. Maggie found her weeping in her room, cradling a wooden spoon and muttering, "He said I was too old, but I tasted it. I tasted life again." Lillian died that night. Her body was not taken to the crematorium but wheeled toward the cellar. When Maggie questioned Dr. Shale, she was told, "Some things return to the earth differently. You'll learn." But Maggie had already begun her own investigation. She found the laundry chute key, and one night after the staff had retired and the last broth had been poured, she slipped down into the sub-basement lantern, trembling in her hand. She expected cold stone. What she found was warmth, wet warmth. The walls pulsed faintly. A row of clay jars lined the corridor, each labeled not with patient names but with infant dates. At the far end a carved archway, and within it a chamber, circular, lined with shelves. In its center a stone cradle, massive, blackened with age, and surrounded by dried rose petals. And in the cradle, she didn't remember what she saw, not clearly, only the sensation that something was awake and watching. She ran. But before she reached the stairwell, a hand touched her shoulder. Firm. Cold. Dr. Kressner stood behind her, eyes like cracked marble. "You listened," he said gently. "That was your first mistake. But you saw, and that makes you valuable." She never returned upstairs. Part 10. The Institute That Wouldn't Stay Closed. On August 11, 1888, without warning, Cold Elm Rise was shuttered. The official story was mundane funding disputes, a breach of safety regulations, and a single anonymous complaint about unsanitary conditions in the lower cellars. No arrests, no public scandal, but those who worked in the nearby town's laundry vendors, coal suppliers, even the postmaster told a different story. They spoke of strange lights at night, screams mistaken for birdsong, entire deliveries of goat's milk and powdered bone vanishing into a place no one could confirm even had a kitchen. And then there were the flies. Not swarms, just one. Always just one. Following, landing on the same hand, the same eyelid, as if remembering someone. The building was boarded up, sealed by state officials with wax and lead. Signs were posted warning of structural instability. By winter, snow covered the roofs. But something beneath the earth never froze. In 1891, a group of academics from a secretive New England society known as the Hollow Concordat quietly petitioned to purchase the property for preservation and study. Their offer was denied. 3 years later, the structure was found partially excavated, its floorboards, torn up stone foundation exposed. No arrests were made. The case was dismissed as vandalism. But a pattern had begun. From 1895 to 1903, at least 5 other restorative clinics opened under varying names across the Northeast. All bore similar architecture, similar staff hierarchies, similar nightly rituals. And in each the same phrase appeared sometimes in pamphlets, sometimes carved into the foundation stone, always in Latin ossa red. Memoria in carne. Return the bones. Memory lives in flesh. These institutes never lasted long. A fire in Maine, a collapse in Vermont, an outbreak in western Massachusetts, though no one ever clarified what the illness was. But wherever they opened, reports followed missing infants, restored elders, the sound of a cradle rocking in the night. Back at Cold Elm Rise, the forest had begun reclaiming the land. Yet visitors, mostly thrill-seekers, some researchers continued to vanish. 3 college students in 1911, 2 war veterans in 1920, a pair of lovers in 1934 whose bones were found months later, carefully laid in parallel, each clutching a spoon. In 1955, a geologist drilling core samples struck a void beneath the hill where the chapel once stood. His report noted empty cavity, 40 feet across, lined with polished stone, smelled chalk milk, wet iron. The drilling ceased. The land was sold once again. And this time, it stayed in private hands. No one has set foot beneath the hill in over 70 years. But the air, say locals, remains warm even in winter. And the wind, they say, still hums. A lullaby. In 1986, Dr. Alice Marrow, an archivist of occult folklore at Hawthorne University, received an anonymous package. It contained no return address. Inside, a faded photocopy of Edmund Harker's journal. Pages torn, handwriting erratic. But the symbols matched those Alice had seen once before, carved into bone flutes unearthed from a forgotten Carpathian burial site. At the bottom of the final page was a single typed message: Elmsbrook never died. It moved. Marrow was no stranger to fringe cases. She had written academic papers on ritual linguistics, psychogenic illness, and colonial-era healing cults. But something about this journal pulled at her. Within a month, she was standing on the hill where Cold Elm Rise once stood, its ruins now no more than moss-choked stones, and a crumbling wall half swallowed by pine roots. She brought only a notebook, a voice recorder, and a grant from the university too small to cover anything but gas and tape. Locals refused to speak to her. Old maps had been erased, overwritten. The county archives had no records of Cold Elm Rise, but the land remembered. On her second night camping near the hill, she recorded the following in her field notes: 3:12 a.m. Woke to the sound of wood creaking. No wind. No trees moving. It sounded like something rocking. Steady, measured, back and forth. Faint scent of something, sweet and rotten. She dug at dawn. Not deep, just enough to clear a corner of stone beneath the overgrowth. It was smooth, almost glassy. Symbols etched into its surface shimmered with frost, despite the summer heat. On the fourth day, her shovel struck something hollow. A lid. She hesitated. Every rational instinct told her to stop. She opened it anyway. Inside, a wooden cradle. Preserved impossibly well. Blackened, scorched along the edges but intact. And nestled within it, wrapped in linen, was a single clay jar. Unmarked, still sealed. She brought it home. She shouldn't have. In the weeks that followed, her recordings changed. What began as scholarly notes turned into whispers, then humming, then silence. Friends said she stopped attending class. Neighbors reported strange noises, wooden tapping like a chair rocking across the floor. Alice's final note, written in the margin of her university ledger, simply read, "I didn't open the jar." But it did. After Alice Marrow vanished in the fall of 1986, her small apartment in Albany was sealed for investigation. Foul play was suspected, though no sign of forced entry or struggle was found. Nothing was missing, except Alice herself. But inside her study, on a heavy oak desk beneath a reading lamp still burning, police discovered an object they did not catalog publicly. A small clay jar lid, cracked slightly. The air in the room was unusually warm. The jar was turned over to university officials who handed it off to an anthropological team from Boston under strict confidentiality. That team, led by Dr. Raymond Kerr, soon reported that the object was of indeterminate origin but bore chemical similarities to calcined human bone and powdered mother's milk. Inside the jar was no parchment, no relic, just dust. Fine, pale, and faintly sweet-smelling, and mixed into that dust beneath microscope were fragments of human tooth enamel, infant enamel. Dr. Kerr, a rational man with decades of field experience, documented the analysis in sterile terms. But in a personal letter to a colleague written weeks before he left the project entirely, he said, "We didn't find the jar. The jar found us. It's not an artifact. It's a seed. And I think she watered it." Soon after, strange phenomena began within the department. The audio loggers in the lab captured faint lullabies at night, melodies no one could trace. Bone samples from unrelated studies began yellowing, softening into a paste. One intern reported hearing a child crying inside the ventilation system. No children had been on campus for days. The jar was quietly placed into a containment vault, sealed with lead, and buried beneath the university's geology annex. But the damage had already spread. 3 months later, Dr. Kerr's wife miscarried without explanation. His assistant developed bone cancer in her jaw, and another faculty member visiting the site where Alice first unearthed the cradle was found weeks later, wandering Route 20, barefoot, whispering, "It's still rocking." It never stops. That year, snowfall came early, unseasonably heavy. And beneath the frost line, beneath the roots of the forgotten pines and shuttered histories, the soil began to loosen. Waiting. Part 13. The Infant Who Remembered Fire. In 2017, a child was born in upstate New York. Healthy, full term, no complications. His name was Jonah Marrow. His mother, Evelyn, claimed no relation to the missing folklorist Alice Marrow, but DNA records quietly accessed years later by private researchers confirmed they shared a bloodline, though separated by 3 generations. Jonah cried like any baby, but his teeth came in early. Too early. By 3 weeks, 4 incisors. By 2 months, molars. By 5 months, all his baby teeth had erupted. Doctors were baffled. Specialists chalked it up to rare genetic acceleration. But that wasn't all. He refused milk. Would scream when held near his mother's breast. Bottles, too, were rejected. Until one night in desperation, Evelyn offered him warm vegetable broth. He drank deeply, and after that, only bone-based stocks would suffice. Chicken, lamb, veal, anything else he'd vomit up. Then came the sleepwalking. At 10 months, long before he could speak, Jonah would rise at night and rock himself in his crib, eyes open unblinking, humming a melody no one had taught him. Evelyn recorded it once, played it for her pediatrician. The man went pale. He claimed to recognize the tune from an anthropology lecture in college, a folk song from Eastern Europe, but not one for children, a cradle song for the dead. And then Jonah began to whisper. At first it was nonsense syllables, then words. One night Evelyn awoke to find him standing by her bed, eyes locked on her. He whispered, "I've been here before." The fire hurt, but the bones were kind. At age 2, his drawings began. Not stick figures, not houses, but cradles. Always the same shape, surrounded by fire, sometimes filled with tiny mouths, always open, always silent. One drawing was labeled in letters too perfect for his age, the hollow rocker. By 3, Jonah stopped speaking entirely. Doctors said regression, trauma, some unnamed spectrum. But Evelyn knew better. Because one night as she rocked him to sleep, he reached up, touched her cheek, and whispered, not with fear, but with certainty, "It's coming back. I opened it. I'm sorry." Part 14. When the Cradles returned. In the winter of 2022, a series of unexplained events rippled quietly through Schoharie County, New York. It began in local hospitals. 3 newborns, all from different towns, were found missing their first teeth before they were even 2 days old. No sign of trauma, no blood, just small, clean gaps in their pink gums. Next came the nursery fires. 4 homes, each with infants under 1 year old, reported crib fires starting spontaneously. No electrical cause. The flames were localized, burning only the cradle, leaving surrounding furniture untouched. In each case, neighbors swore they heard a sound before the fire started, like a song. Not loud, just very old. Police were baffled. Fire marshals blamed faulty heaters. But those who paid attention saw the pattern. All 4 families had months earlier received anonymous gifts, hand-carved wooden mobiles shaped like cradles, mailed with no return address. All burned in the blazes, and still the children survived unharmed. But something had changed in them. They stopped crying, stopped blinking, and one by one they began drawing pictures. Cradles, fire, a mouth lined with ribs. Meanwhile, Evelyn Marrow, now a recluse, posted a final blog entry before deleting all her online presence. It read, "Jonah hasn't spoken in months, but he hums at night. It's always the same tune. Last night he whispered, 'The others are waking too.'" The next day, her house was found abandoned. No sign of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Just a wooden spoon, polished smooth, left on the child's pillow. In nearby Albany, a professor at the university's Archival Studies Department reviewing microfilm from the 1880s noticed something odd. Dozens of property sale documents across New York State now bore a new clause at the bottom. Soil contains no memory. This site has been cleared. The vessel remains dormant. No such language had appeared before 2017. No one could trace who added it. And all the sites with that clause had one thing in common. They were built atop ash pits, old ones, quiet ones, where once the cradle had rocked. In March of 2024, a construction crew began clearing forest near the Catskill foothills for a luxury retreat center. The plans were ambitious spa facilities, mineral pools, a wellness library. But when they broke ground, their equipment struck stone. Beneath the frost line, 6 feet down, lay a chamber, dry, circular, and lined with blackened glass bricks, each carved with the symbols no archaeologist recognized. At the chamber's center was a hollow depression. Oval, slightly scorched. A cradle had once rested there. The site foreman, a man named Ellis Weaver, dismissed the workers' unease. He instructed them to fill it in. The retreat had a schedule to keep. That night, Ellis's wife found him sitting in their nursery at home. Their infant son was asleep. Ellis was rocking. Not the baby, not the chair. Just his hand back and forth over an empty space in the air. When she asked what he was doing, he said, "Making room." The next day, he quit without explanation. Within weeks, 7 other crew members left the project. 1 developed jaw necrosis. 2 reported dreams of burning wood and spoon-fed ash. Another, found sleepwalking near the excavation site, whispered, "The marrow is awake." The retreat was abandoned. The land sold again. But no one broke ground after that, because by then, something had already risen. Across the region and further out than anyone expected, reports began to circulate infants born with fully formed molars, children humming songs their parents didn't know, nurses in neonatal wards fainting at the scent of broth. A research team in Boston uncovered genetic anomalies in newborn marrow density. The pattern mirrored samples found in Cold Elm Rise's sealed archives before those archives inexplicably caught fire. And in quiet homes in the dead of night, parents began hearing a noise through the baby monitors. Not crying, not speech, just the steady creak of wood, rocking. Sometimes the sound moved from the nursery down the hall to the parents' door. One mother unplugged the monitor only to hear the noise with her own ears. Outside her bedroom. She opened the door. There was nothing there, but the air smelled like warm milk and scorched pine. And from somewhere deep beneath the house, beneath the soil, beneath memory, came a low, breathless hum. A lullaby. Still rocking, still waiting, because the cradle was never just a relic. It was a promise. And it remembers every child, every bone, every mouth that fed it.